Did you ever hear tales of medieval women where they always locked away, powerless, and voiceless from around 500 CE to 1500 CE? Did they truly have no say in their lives or the world around them? Number 9. Medieval society was completely monolithic, with no diversity in women's experiences. The common story sometimes suggests that all women in the Middle Ages lived the exact same life, bound by the same rules and facing the same challenges. This picture often paints a broad brush stroke over 1,000 years of history and countless different cultures. It gives the impression that a peasant woman in 12th century France had the same daily routine and social standing as a queen in 8th century Byzantium or a merchant woman in 14th century Italy, but that is far from the reality historians have uncovered. The lives of women during this long period were as varied as the tapestry of medieval Europe itself. Their experiences were deeply shaped by their social class, their geographic location, their marital status, and even their individual talents and choices. A noblewoman, for instance, might spend her days managing a vast estate, overseeing servants, engaging in political correspondence, or even defending a castle while her husband was away at war. Her education, though often informal, could include reading, writing, Latin, and even elements of law or estate management. She would participate in courtly life, acting as a patron of arts, influencing political decisions through her husband, sons, or even directly, as many queen regents demonstrated. Her clothing would be fine, her food plentiful, and her access to travel and broader knowledge far greater than that of a woman of lesser standing. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who ruled as Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right and later became Queen of France and then Queen of England, clearly had a life of immense power and complexity, engaging in crusades and rebellion. Her life was nothing like that of a village woman. Contrast this with the daily existence of a peasant woman. Her life was largely dictated by the rhythm of agricultural labor. She would be involved in planting, harvesting, milking cows, tending to livestock, and preparing food for her family. Her days were long and physically demanding, often beginning before dawn and ending long after sunset. Her dwelling would be a simple cottage, perhaps shared with animals, and her clothes would be plain and functional. Her education, if any, would be practical skills passed down through generations, focused on household management, farming, and perhaps basic healing. Yet, even within the peasant class, there was variation. A peasant woman who owned her own small plot of land had a different level of autonomy than one who worked solely for a lord. A woman whose husband was a skilled artisan, such as a blacksmith or carpenter, might find her family in a slightly better economic position, perhaps allowing her a bit more comfort or access to local markets. Urban women experience yet another distinct set of circumstances. The women in towns and cities often participated directly in trade and crafts. They might run shops, work as brewers, bakers, weavers, or even be involved in more specialized trades like book production or silk weaving. Many women were members of guilds, which provided them with a measure of protection, economic opportunity, and social standing. And a widow in particular often had the legal right to continue her husband's trade, giving her significant economic independence. The records of medieval London and Paris show numerous women owning businesses, engaging in legal disputes, and acting as independent economic agents. A merchant woman from a city like Florence or Venice might travel for business, negotiate deals, and manage complex financial accounts. Her life was very different from a woman tied to the land. Geographic location also played a huge role. The legal and social systems varied significantly across Europe. In some parts of Scandinavia, women had more extensive property rights than in parts of France. In the Byzantine Empire, empresses like Theodora or Zoe wielded immense political power and influenced religious doctrine in ways that would have been unimaginable for many women in the fragmented kingdoms of Western Europe during certain periods. In Islamic Spain, while under different religious and cultural frameworks, women still participated in public life, scholarship, and commerce, often with greater freedoms in certain areas than their Christian counterparts. The interactions between different cultures and the impact of the Reconquista also changed the experiences of women in the Iberian Peninsula. Marital status created further distinctions. A young unmarried woman, a maiden, might have had less personal freedom, often living under the direct authority of her father or male guardian. A married woman's rights and responsibilities were often intertwined with her husband's, though she maintained certain dower rights and legal protections regarding her property. A widow, however, often enjoyed the greatest autonomy. She regained control over her dowry and dower, could manage her own property, choose whether or not to remarry and whom to marry, and even pursue a profession or business independent of male oversight. This financial and social independence for widows is well documented in legal records and wills from across medieval Europe. Even within the religious sphere, there was significant diversity. A woman who chose to enter a convent, particularly as an abbess, could wield immense power and influence. Abbesses like Hildegard of Bingen were intellectual powerhouses, advising popes and emperors, composing music, writing theological treatises, and managing vast monastic estates. Other nuns were scholars, artists, or scribes, contributing significantly to the preservation and creation of knowledge. Their lives were vastly different from those of laywomen, offering opportunities for learning, spiritual development, and leadership that were not available to all. So the idea that medieval women were all the same ignores the rich and complex tapestry of their lives. A woman's experience depended on her social standing, her geographic location, her family's wealth, her religion, and her individual circumstances. To lump them all together under one single, often grim, description misses the immense variety and resilience that defined the lives of women throughout the Middle Ages. Historians often point to the different legal codes, like the Salic law in some Germanic kingdoms versus the common law in England, which had varying impacts on women's property rights and inheritance, further highlighting these regional differences. Number 8. Women were always seen as inherently weak, fragile, and needing protection. The image of medieval women as universally delicate and in constant need of male protection is a persistent one. This picture often comes from later romanticized visions of chivalry or from focusing solely on the ideal of noble ladies in poetry. However, historical records, archaeological findings, and the realities of medieval life show a much more varied and often robust perception and experience of female strength. Life in the Middle Ages, whether on a farm, in a bustling town, or even within a castle, demanded a great deal of physical and mental resilience from everyone, women included. For the vast majority of women who lived in peasant communities, physical strength was not just an advantage, it was a necessity for survival. Women participated directly in agricultural labor. They worked in the fields alongside men, planting crops, weeding, and participating in the demanding work of harvest. They carried water, gathered firewood, tended livestock, and processed food. The sheer physical exertion involved in these daily tasks would have built considerable strength and stamina. The records from manorial courts often describe women involved in disputes over land use or resources, not as helpless figures, but as active participants in their community's economic life. Anthropological studies of skeletal remains from medieval burial sites sometimes show evidence of muscle attachments and bone density consistent with strenuous physical activity in both men and women. Beyond the fields, women in urban centers also performed physically demanding labor. They worked as brewers, carrying heavy vats of ale. They operated looms, which required strength and endurance. Bakers kneaded dough for hours. Washerwomen toiled with heavy loads of laundry by hand. These were not light tasks, and the women performing them were not considered fragile. Their contributions were essential to the economy of the town and the survival of their families. Guild records sometimes indicate that women, including widows, took over their husbands' trades, implying they were capable of continuing the manual labor involved. Even within the nobility, where the ideal of the lady might suggest fragility, reality was often different. Noble women were expected to manage vast households, which could involve overseeing dozens or even hundreds of servants, managing supplies, and directing the daily operations of a large estate. This was a mentally and physically demanding role. They might ride horses for long distances, participate in hunts often involving hawking or riding with hounds, and travel extensively. When a castle was under siege, noblewomen sometimes played active roles in its defense. Joan of Arc, the famous French military leader, is perhaps the most iconic example of a woman engaging in warfare. But there are other less famous instances of women leading defenses, like Jeanne de Montfort, who famously put on armor and led troops during the Breton War of Succession, or Agnes Randolph, Countess of Dunbar, who successfully defended her castle against an English siege in the 14th century, earning the nickname Black Agnes for her determination. These women were not seen as weak, but as formidable leaders. Childbirth, a central experience for most medieval women, further highlights a different understanding of female strength. While perilous, it was a natural process that was seen as a testament to a woman's inherent resilience. Medieval medical texts and everyday practices show that communities recognized the strength required for women to endure labor and bring new life into the world. Midwives, who were almost exclusively women, held respected positions in society, assisting in this often dangerous but fundamental aspect of life. The very act of surviving multiple childbirths demonstrated immense physical and mental fortitude. The concept of protection in medieval society also needs careful examination. While women were certainly vulnerable to violence, just as men were, the idea of universal male protection was often about societal roles and property rights, not necessarily an assumption of inherent female physical weakness. A lord protected his tenants, male and female, as part of his feudal duty. A husband protected his wife and family as head of the household. This protection was often about legal standing and property, ensuring the continuation of the family line and the stability of the social order, rather than just physical defense. Furthermore, medieval literature and folklore, while sometimes portraying damsels in distress, also featured powerful female figures, including warrior women, cunning strategists, and strong matriarchs. From Celtic goddesses and queens to the Valkyries of Norse mythology, stories of women who defied gender expectations were present. These narratives, alongside historical examples, suggest that medieval people were quite aware of the diverse capabilities of women, including their physical and mental strength. The idea of the weak and fragile woman was not a universal or constant perception, but rather one aspect of a complex societal view, often overshadowed by the practical realities of survival and governance. The evidence suggests that the physical demands of daily life often pushed women beyond any idealized notions of fragility, demonstrating their enduring capabilities and resilience. Number 7. The Church universally oppressed women and denied them spiritual authority. It is a common belief that the medieval church, a dominant force in medieval society, was an institution that relentlessly oppressed women, silencing their voices and denying them any form of spiritual authority or leadership. While the church certainly held patriarchal views and restricted women from certain roles, particularly the priesthood, a closer look reveals a far more complex picture, demonstrating avenues through which women achieved immense spiritual power, influence, and even theological prominence. The church, in its vastness and duration, offered both constraints and opportunities for women. One of the most profound examples of female spiritual authority within the church was the cult of the Virgin Mary. Mary, the mother of Jesus, became a central figure of devotion throughout the Middle Ages. Her veneration reached astonishing heights, inspiring countless cathedrals, artworks, hymns, and theological writings. And Mary was seen as the Queen of Heaven, an intercessor between humanity and God, and a source of immense comfort and hope. Her image often symbolized purity, compassion, and strength. The widespread devotion to Mary provided a powerful female archetype within Christian theology and popular piety, suggesting a profound spiritual significance for the feminine that complicates any simple narrative of universal oppression. Women in particular found solace and a model of virtue in the Virgin Mary. Female saints also played a crucial role in medieval spiritual life. Women like St. Catherine of Siena, St. Bridget of Sweden, and St. Clare of Assisi were not just revered figures, but active agents of spiritual and social change. Catherine of Siena, a Dominican tertiary, was a mystic, a reformer, and a diplomat who famously advised popes, mediated conflicts between Italian city-states, and played a significant role in convincing Pope Gregory XI to return the papacy to Rome from Avignon. She dictated letters, visions, and theological works, demonstrating a profound spiritual authority that transcended typical gender roles. Bridget of Sweden, a noblewoman and mystic, founded a monastic order and wrote extensively, offering spiritual guidance and even prophecies to rulers and church leaders. These women, among many others, were seen as directly touched by God, and their pronouncements carried immense weight, often challenging political and ecclesiastical powers. Monastic life offered women a unique path to spiritual and even temporal power. These abbesses, the leaders of convents, held positions of considerable authority. They governed large estates, managed substantial financial resources, administered justice over their tenants, and often exercised significant influence within their communities and beyond. These women were not just spiritual leaders, but powerful administrators and landowners. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, is perhaps the most famous example. She was a visionary, a theologian, a composer. Her musical compositions are still performed today, a philosopher, and a natural scientist. She corresponded with emperors, kings, popes, and bishops, offering advice and sometimes sharp criticism. Her theological writings and visionary accounts were widely respected and disseminated. Ratsvit of Gandersheim, a 10th century canoness, was a playwright and poet, the first known female dramatist in the Western world, whose works demonstrated intellectual prowess and engaged with classical and Christian themes. These women used their monastic positions as platforms for intellectual, artistic, and spiritual leadership, indicating that the church, at least in certain monastic contexts, provided spaces for female empowerment and authority. Mysticism was another avenue for women to express profound spiritual authority. Female mystics often claimed direct communication with God, receiving visions and revelations that were sometimes recorded and circulated, influencing religious thought and practice. Julian of Norwich, a 14th century English anchoress, wrote Revelations of Divine Love, one of the earliest surviving books in the English language written by a woman. Her theological insights into God's unconditional love and maternal aspects of the divine were profound and continue to be studied today. Marguerite Porret, a Beguine mystic, wrote, The Mirror of Simple Souls, a controversial but influential theological text that led to her execution, but also demonstrated the depth of female theological inquiry and spiritual daring. While some female mystics faced persecution, many others were revered, and their spiritual wisdom widely sought. Even in the secular world, women participated actively in religious life through confraternities, charitable organizations, and pilgrimage. These avenues allowed laywomen to express their piety, engage in community service, and build networks of support. Women often led and funded the building of chapels and altars, commissioning religious art, and acting as patrons for religious institutions, thus shaping the material culture of medieval Christianity. While the church did not allow women to be priests and often promoted a view of women as physically weaker and more susceptible to sin, these aspects do not tell the whole story. The veneration of the Virgin Mary, the lives of female saints and mystics, and the significant power wielded by abbesses demonstrate that women found diverse and powerful roles within the medieval church. They were not merely passive recipients of doctrine, but active participants, theologians, leaders, and spiritual guides who profoundly shaped the religious landscape of their time. The narrative of universal oppression fails to capture the nuances and opportunities that existed for women within this complex institution. Number 6. Women had no control over their bodies or reproductive choices. The perception that medieval women had absolutely no control over their bodies, particularly concerning reproduction, is a widespread but oversimplified view. While it is true that medieval society, influenced by patriarchal structures and limited medical knowledge, did not grant women the same level of bodily autonomy as modern societies aspire to, there were certainly elements of agency, resistance, and choice that existed for women during this period. The realities of life, including economic necessity, social customs, and even personal desire, often allowed for some degree of control over their reproductive lives, even if it was subtle or indirect. Marriage was a central institution in medieval life, and while arranged marriages were common, particularly among the nobility, the concept of consent was often legally and religiously required for the marriage to be valid. Church law, which became increasingly influential throughout the Middle Ages, stipulated that a marriage required the free consent of both the man and the woman. While this consent could be coerced, there are documented cases where women refused marriages or sought annulments on grounds of lack of consent, though often with difficulty. A woman's refusal could sometimes stall or even prevent a marriage, especially if she had powerful family backing or strong convictions. This direct no to a union that would dictate her reproductive future was a significant, albeit challenging, exercise of bodily autonomy. After marriage, while the primary purpose was often procreation, the idea of spacing children was not entirely unknown, especially for women who faced economic hardship or were concerned about the physical toll of frequent pregnancies. Although explicit methods of contraception, as understood today, were largely absent or not widely discussed, medieval women likely relied on traditional knowledge, including herbal remedies, to influence fertility or induce abortion. While these practices were often dangerous and carried social or legal risks, their very existence suggests that women were seeking ways to exert some control. The records of midwives' knowledge and folk medicine often hint at such practices. The Church condemned abortion and certain forms of contraception, but their condemnation itself suggests that these practices were occurring. Furthermore, the act of breastfeeding, known as wet nursing, offered another form of control, albeit an indirect one, over reproductive timing. Extended breastfeeding could naturally suppress ovulation, thus acting as a form of birth spacing. While wet nursing was sometimes an economic necessity for poor women or a social choice for wealthy women who sent their infants to rural wet nurses, it inherently affected a woman's fertility cycle. For peasant women who had to return to physically demanding labor shortly after childbirth, breastfeeding might have been practiced for longer periods, thus delaying subsequent pregnancies. Widows, in particular, had significantly more autonomy over their bodies and reproductive choices than married women. A widow was legally free to choose whether or not to remarry, and if she did, whom to marry. This choice allowed her to decide whether to enter another union that would likely entail further pregnancies. Many widows chose to remain single, particularly if they had inherited property or a successful business, valuing their newfound independence over the social pressure to remarry. This decision to remain single was a powerful assertion of bodily autonomy, as it directly controlled their reproductive future. For example, records show numerous women in urban centers thriving as independent business owners after their husbands' deaths, often choosing not to remarry precisely to maintain that independence. Even within marriage, a woman's refusal to have sexual relations or a desire for a chaste marriage, especially if agreed upon by both partners, could be acknowledged, particularly in the context of religious devotion. While not the norm, such arrangements were sometimes sanctioned by the church if both spouses genuinely consented to celibacy for spiritual reasons. These were rare but serve as examples of some degree of negotiation possible within the marital framework. The limited understanding of human biology and the high rates of infant mortality meant that women faced immense pressures to bear children. However, to say they had no control at all over their bodies or reproductive choices ignores the subtle yet significant ways they navigated these pressures. From legal consent in marriage to the use of traditional remedies, the choice to breastfeed, and the ultimate autonomy of a widow, medieval women found ways to exert agency, however constrained, over their most personal experiences. Their lives were not simply dictated by biological imperative or male authority, but were shaped by a complex interplay of social, economic, and personal factors that allowed for surprising degrees of individual decision-making, even in the realm of reproduction. Number 5, marriage was always about property and lineage, with no room for personal choice or affection. It is often assumed that medieval marriages were cold, calculated alliances solely focused on securing property, consolidating power, or ensuring the continuation of a family lineage, with any notion of personal affection or choice being entirely absent. While pragmatic considerations certainly played a dominant role, especially among the aristocracy, to claim there was no room for personal choice or affection is to paint an incomplete picture of medieval marital life. Love, companionship, and even desire found their way into these unions, and for commoners, personal preference often held more sway. Among the nobility, marriage was indeed a crucial tool for political and economic strategy. Powerful families negotiated unions to secure alliances, acquire land, or solidify social standing. Dowries and dower rights were carefully calculated to protect family wealth. In these circles, personal affection might develop over time, but it was rarely the primary consideration in the initial arrangement. However, even here, an outright refusal by one of the parties, especially if supported by their family, could sometimes derail a proposed marriage, demonstrating a latent, albeit limited, form of personal choice. The Church's insistence on mutual consent for a valid marriage, even if often coerced, still provided a legal loophole for refusal. For instance, the case of Margaret of Flanders refusing to marry Edward I's son despite political pressure highlights that sometimes a woman's will, particularly when backed by her family or political circumstances, could prevent a union. However, for the vast majority of the medieval population, namely peasants and urban commoners, marriage dynamics were somewhat different. While parents might still have a strong say, particularly regarding economic viability, sheer proximity and personal acquaintance often played a larger role. Young people from the same village or town, who worked together or socialized, were more likely to meet and develop feelings for each other. They had more opportunities for informal courtship, such as during festivals, market days, or communal labor. While a peasant family might need to ensure their child married someone who could contribute to the household economy, they were less concerned with grand political alliances or the intricate details of noble lineage. Therefore, love matches, or at least marriages based on mutual attraction and shared daily life, were more plausible and arguably more common among the lower and middle classes. Evidence of affection within marriage can be found in various sources. Legal documents, like wills, sometimes reveal a tenderness between spouses, with husbands leaving specific loving provisions for their wives, or wives making requests for their husbands. Letters, though rare survivals from this period, occasionally show expressions of warmth and longing between absent spouses. For example, some letters between members of the Paston family, a gentry family in 15th century England, reveal affection and concern for each other's well-being, even when discussing practical matters. Love poetry, though often stylized and focused on unrequited courtly love, also suggests an understanding and valuing of romantic affection, which could certainly extend into the marital bond. While not explicitly about marriage, these literary traditions reflect a society that understood and celebrated emotional connection. Sermons and theological writings, while emphasizing marriage as a sacrament for procreation, also stress the importance of companionship and mutual support within the marital union, acknowledging that emotional bonds were an integral part of a successful marriage. The concept of caritas or Christian love was meant to permeate all relationships, including marriage. Furthermore, the high mortality rates meant that many individuals, particularly women, became widows. A widow, as discussed previously, gained significant autonomy. She was free to choose whether or not to remarry, and if she did, her choice of spouse was largely her own. Many widows chose to remarry for companionship, economic security, or even genuine affection, rather than purely for lineage. This freedom for widows provided another avenue for personal choice in marital decisions, demonstrating that societal norms were not universally rigid. The idea that medieval marriages were solely devoid of affection simplifies a complex human reality. While the strategic and economic imperatives were undeniable, particularly at the top of the social ladder, evidence suggests that companionship, affection, and even love were certainly present and valued within many medieval marriages, especially among those who were not dictated by the grand political games of the elite. The practical necessity of living and working together, coupled with a deep human need for connection, often fostered bonds that went beyond mere contractual obligations. Number 4. Education was exclusively for men, and women were largely illiterate. The notion that education in the Middle Ages was solely the domain of men and that women were largely illiterate is a common misconception. While it is true that formal institutions like universities were overwhelmingly male and literacy rates for women were generally lower than for men, this does not mean that women were entirely excluded from learning or that illiteracy was universal among them. Numerous historical examples and records show that women received education in various forms, contributed to intellectual life, and achieved levels of literacy and scholarship that challenge this narrow view. The most prominent centers of female learning were convents and nunneries. These religious houses provided women with a unique opportunity for intellectual development that was often unavailable elsewhere. Nuns were taught to read and write, primarily Latin, the language of scripture and scholarship. They copied manuscripts, illuminated texts, composed music, wrote theological treatises, and engaged in philosophical inquiry. Abbesses, as leaders of these communities, often held significant intellectual authority and managed extensive libraries. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, was an extraordinary polymath who composed music, wrote extensively on theology, natural history, and medicine, and corresponded with powerful figures across Europe. Rotswit of Gandersheim, a 10th century canoness, wrote Latin dramas and poetry, demonstrating profound classical learning. These women were highly literate and intellectual figures, proving that institutions within the church provided pathways to advanced education for women. Among the aristocracy, noblewomen often received a private education at home. Tutors were hired to teach them not only domestic skills, but also reading, writing, basic arithmetic, and sometimes even Latin or French if their native language was English. They were expected to manage large households, which required literacy for accounting, correspondence, and overseeing estates. Many noblewomen were patrons of the arts and literature, commissioning books and supporting scholars. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, was a highly educated woman who fostered a vibrant court culture, and her granddaughters, Blanche of Castile and Berengaria of Castile, were also renowned for their learning and influence as regents. The existence of numerous surviving letters written by noblewomen, like those of the Paston women, further indicates their literacy. Even outside the elite, some women in urban centers, particularly those involved in merchant or craft families, gained literacy for practical reasons. Running a shop, keeping accounts, or engaging in trade often necessitated basic reading and writing skills. Or guild records occasionally mentioned women running businesses, implying their ability to handle transactions and paperwork. Daughters of merchants might learn to read and write to assist with family businesses. While not as widespread as in convents or noble households, functional literacy existed among some segments of the urban female population. For example, some records from Italian city-states show women involved in commercial contracts and legal proceedings requiring at least a basic understanding of written documents. The production of books also involved women. Female scribes and illuminators worked in scriptoria, sometimes in convents, sometimes in commercial workshops. Their meticulous work in copying and decorating manuscripts contributed directly to the dissemination of knowledge. These women were not just copying, but also reading and understanding the texts they produced. This directly contradicts the idea of universal female illiteracy. Furthermore, religious literacy was often promoted even for those who could not read or write. The women learned prayers, hymns, and stories from the Bible and saints' lives through oral traditions, sermons, and visual aids like stained glass windows and church murals. While not formal literacy, this was a form of spiritual education that allowed them to understand and participate in religious life. For those who could read, popular religious texts, including books of hours, personal prayer books, were widely owned and used by laywomen. These books were often beautifully illustrated and served as a central part of a literate woman's devotional practice. While a significant portion of the female population, especially peasant women, remained illiterate due to the demands of their labor-intensive lives and lack of access to formal schooling, it is a simplification to say that women were universally uneducated or illiterate. Convents provided intellectual havens, noble women received private tutelage for managing their estates, and urban women sometimes acquired literacy for practical economic purposes. The presence of female authors, scribes, and patrons of learning demonstrates that medieval women were not passive recipients of male-dominated education, but active participants and contributors to the intellectual and cultural life of their time. Number 3. Women had no political power or influence in medieval kingdoms. The idea that medieval women were entirely devoid of political power and influence, confined to the domestic sphere with no say in the affairs of kingdoms, is a significant oversimplification. While direct rule was less common for women than for men, and patriarchal norms certainly favored male leadership, numerous medieval women wielded immense political power, shaped policy, commanded armies, and even ruled in their own right. Their influence often stemmed from their positions as queens, noblewomen, or abbesses, but it was real and impactful, far beyond mere domesticity. Queen consorts, though married to kings, were often much more than just royal wives. Many acted as regents for their young sons or absent husbands, a role that granted them supreme authority during periods of great vulnerability for the kingdom. Blanche of Castile, mother of Louis IX of France, was an extraordinarily effective regent. She not only governed France during her son's minority, but also put down several major baronial rebellions, negotiated peace treaties, and ensured the stability of the kingdom. Her political acumen and leadership were widely acknowledged and respected even by her opponents. Another notable example is Matilda of England, daughter of King Henry I, who fought a protracted civil war for the English throne in the 12th century, demonstrating her ambition and capacity for political struggle. While she ultimately did not secure the throne for herself, her actions had profound political consequences. The empresses in the Byzantine Empire often held even more direct and overt political power. Theodora, empress to Justinian I in the 6th century, was a powerful co-ruler who advised her husband on legal and political matters, saved his throne during the Nika riots, and influenced religious policy. Later Byzantine empresses like Zoe and Theodora, not the same as Justinian's wife, ruled in their own right, commissioning coinage with their images, engaging in diplomacy, and directing imperial affairs, highlighting a distinct tradition of female imperial power in the East. Noblewomen, though not on the throne, also held significant political sway. As mistresses of castles and estates, they were often responsible for managing lands, tenants, and local administration in the absence of their husbands, who might be away at war or court. This meant they often acted as judges in local disputes, oversaw economic production, and maintained the feudal order. Many also engaged in political correspondence, influencing powerful male relatives and negotiating alliances. Eleanor of Aquitaine, as Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, ruled a vast territory and was a major political player in 12th century Europe. Her marriages to the kings of France and England further amplified her influence, and she was a key figure in the politics of her time, engaging in rebellions and crusades. Isabella of France, wife of Edward II of England, famously led an invasion of England with her lover Roger Mortimer, deposed her husband, and ruled as regent for her young son, Edward III, for several years. Her actions were undeniably political and had a profound impact on English history. Women also exerted political influence through patronage. Wealthy noblewomen and queens often patronized artists, scholars, and religious institutions. This not only shaped cultural life, but also provided a means to express their piety, enhance their family's prestige, and build networks of loyalty and influence. For instance, medieval queens often founded monasteries or endowed churches, acts that had significant political and social implications. Even in times of war, women could step into roles of military and political leadership. While Joan of Arc is the most famous example, leading French armies to victory in the 15th century, there are other documented instances of women taking direct action in defense of their lands. Agnes Randolph, Countess of Dunbar, famously defended her castle against a siege by the English in the 14th century, throwing insults and cleaning the battlements with a white cloth after each shot, successfully holding out for months. These examples demonstrate that in moments of crisis, the gender barrier to political and military leadership could be broken. Furthermore, abbesses, as discussed previously, held temporal power over vast monastic estates, which included jurisdiction over lands, tenants, and resources. Their decisions had real political and economic consequences for their regions, and they often interacted with secular rulers on an equal footing, negotiating, advising, and asserting their authority. While the king was typically male, the queen, the noblewoman, and the abbess were not silent figures in the background. They were active participants in the political landscape of their time, wielding power through regency, diplomacy, land management, patronage, and sometimes even direct military action. To suggest they had no political power ignores the significant roles played by countless women throughout the medieval period whose actions shaped kingdoms and influenced the course of history. Number 2, women were entirely confined to the domestic sphere and never ventured out. The common image of medieval women often places them strictly within the confines of their homes, leading lives entirely devoted to domestic chores and child-rearing, with little to no interaction with the outside world. This perception, while partially true for some aspects of medieval life, does not reflect the full reality. The vast majority of medieval women, regardless of their social class, engaged in extensive activities outside the home, whether for economic necessity, social interaction, religious devotion, or even political reasons. Their lives were far from being solely domestic. For peasant women, who constituted the largest portion of the population, daily life was inextricably linked to the outdoors. They worked in the fields alongside men, performing strenuous agricultural labor such as planting, weeding, harvesting, and tending to livestock. They gathered firewood, fetched water from wells or rivers, and collected herbs from forests. These tasks were not confined to the home, but were essential for the survival of their families and the wider community. Their contributions to the agricultural economy were fundamental, proving that their lives were deeply intertwined with the landscape around them. Urban women also spent considerable time outside the home, primarily for economic purposes. Many women ran businesses, often from their homes, but also in shops or at market stalls. They were brewers, bakers, textile workers, merchants, and shopkeepers. They traveled to markets to buy and sell goods, negotiated with suppliers and customers, and managed their finances. Records from towns like medieval Paris and London show numerous women operating independent trades and participating actively in the urban economy. For example, women ran taverns and inns, which were public spaces requiring constant interaction with a diverse clientele. They were essential components of the bustling medieval economy, often visible in public spaces. Social and religious life also drew women out of their homes. Church attendance was a regular activity for most people, and women participated fully in mass, religious festivals, and communal prayers. Pilgrimages were another significant reason for women to travel. Thousands of medieval women undertook long and arduous journeys to visit holy sites such as Canterbury, Rome, or Jerusalem. These pilgrimages were not just acts of piety, but also significant social events, offering opportunities for travel, new experiences, and interaction with people from different regions and backgrounds. Margaret Kempe, a 15th century English mystic, famously dictated an autobiography that chronicles her extensive travels throughout Europe on pilgrimages, demonstrating a life far from domestic confinement. Even aristocratic women, despite the idealized image of the sheltered lady, had active lives outside their castles. They often traveled between their various estates, accompanied their husbands to court or on campaigns, and visited friends and relatives. They participated in outdoor activities like hunting and hawking. When their husbands were away at war or on crusades, noblewomen were responsible for managing the estate, which involved interacting with tenants, overseeing agricultural production, and sometimes even defending the castle from attack. This required them to be visible, active figures in their local communities. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for instance, traveled extensively with her courts and even accompanied her first husband, Louis VII, on the Second Crusade, a journey spanning thousands of miles. More midwives, who were almost exclusively women, regularly traveled from house to house within their communities to assist with childbirth. Female healers who used herbal remedies and traditional medical knowledge also moved about to tend to the sick. These roles were vital to medieval society and required women to be mobile and engaged with the public. While it is true that certain aspects of medieval society, particularly for upper-class women, promoted an ideal of seclusion or domesticity, the practical realities of daily life for the vast majority of women required them to be active participants in the public sphere. Whether working in the fields, trading in the markets, attending religious services, embarking on pilgrimages, or managing vast estates, medieval women were constantly venturing out, contributing directly to the economic, social, and spiritual fabric of their communities. The idea of their universal confinement is simply not supported by historical evidence. Number 1, medieval women were completely subservient and had no legal rights. The widespread belief that medieval women were entirely subservient to men, lacking any legal rights or agency, is a persistent myth that overlooks the complex realities of medieval legal systems and societal structures. While patriarchal norms were certainly prevalent, and women's rights were often subordinate to men's, there were significant variations across different regions, social classes, and time periods. Moreover, women possessed various legal rights, especially concerning property, and often exercised surprising levels of autonomy and legal standing in courts. One of the most important legal rights for women in many medieval societies was the concept of dower. This provision ensured that a widow received a portion, typically one-third, of her deceased husband's land and property for her lifetime. This dower was not simply a courtesy, it was a legal entitlement that the husband could not alienate without his wife's consent. This meant that, upon her husband's death, a widow often gained significant economic independence and control over substantial assets. She could manage these lands, collect rents, and make legal decisions regarding them. For example, the Domesday Book from 11th century England records numerous women holding land in their own right, and later legal documents confirm the ongoing importance of dower rights. These widowed women often appeared in court to defend their property rights or engage in lawsuits, demonstrating their active legal standing. Furthermore, married women, although legally considered under the coverture of their husbands in some legal systems like English common law, still retain certain rights. For instance, a wife's dowry, the property she brought into the marriage, often remained her own property, even if managed by her husband. In some continental European legal systems, particularly those influenced by Roman law, married women retained more distinct legal identities and control over their property. In parts of Italy, for example, women could engage in business transactions independently of their husbands, even signing contracts. Women also had legal standing in courts, though their ability to act varied. They could sue and be sued, particularly if they were widows or single women theme souls. Many court records show women appearing in court over property disputes, debt collection, assaults, or slander. They served as witnesses, brought accusations, and defended themselves. While their voice in court might have been mediated by male relatives in some cases, their presence and participation in legal proceedings were undeniable. For instance, manorial court rolls from medieval England reveal women participating actively in village life, reporting infractions, and engaging in petty lawsuits. In urban areas, women often had more economic and legal autonomy. Many women ran their own businesses as brewers, bakers, weavers, innkeepers, or merchants. Guilds, which regulated trades, often admitted women as members, allowing them to train, work, and own businesses. A widow was usually legally entitled to continue her husband's trade, which gave her significant economic power and independence. These women were not subservient in their economic lives, but were active and vital contributors to the urban economy, possessing the legal right to engage in commerce. Religious women, particularly abbesses, held enormous legal and temporal power. They governed vast monastic estates, which included courts where they exercised jurisdiction over tenants and legal disputes. Abbesses were significant landowners and often had considerable influence with secular rulers and church officials. Their legal authority was recognized and respected, making them powerful figures in their respective regions. Even in marriage, the church's insistence on mutual consent for a valid marriage, even if often ignored in practice, provided a legal basis for a woman's refusal to marry. While coercion was common, there are documented instances of women resisting unwanted unions, sometimes successfully, particularly if they had family backing or strong convictions. This minimal legal right to refuse a marriage, which would define their entire future, indicates a degree of agency. The idea that medieval women were completely without rights simplifies a complex legal and social landscape. While they lived in a patriarchal society, medieval women possessed significant legal rights concerning property, dower, and inheritance, particularly as widows. They participated in legal proceedings, ran businesses, and as religious leaders, wielded temporal power. The extent of their rights varied by region, class, and marital status, but to state they had no legal rights is to disregard the historical evidence that demonstrates their agency and participation within the medieval legal framework.